The envelope felt wrong. Not the paper, though it was thick, creamy stark that suggested a formality I hadn't encountered in years. It was the weight, too dense for mere correspondence. I ran my thumb over the embossed crest, a knot of apprehension tightening in my gut. My estranged grandmother. I hadn't heard from her in 20 years, not since. Well, not since. My studio was a controlled chaos of pigment and canvas, a deliberate mess that mirrored the state of my mind. I'd been working on a new piece, a triptych that wrestled with fractured memories, but the canvas felt stubbornly blank tonight. The city hummed outside my loft window, a distant, indifferent symphony. I preferred it that way. Connection had always been a precarious thing for me, easily shattered. The return address was Blackwood Manor. The name itself was a whisper from a forgotten age, a place I'd tried to scrub from my consciousness like a particularly stubborn stain. The courier, a man with eyes that seemed to have seen too much, had handed it to me with a hesitant nod, his own unease a palpable thing in the sterile hallway. He hadn't lingered. My hands trembled as I slit the envelope. Inside, a single sheet of the same heavy paper, bearing a legal seal and a solicitor's curt, formal prose. My grandmother, Lila Blackwood, had passed, and I, Dean Blackwood, was his sole heir. Blackwood Manor and everything within it was now mine. A cold dread, unlike anything I'd felt since childhood, seeped into my bones. Inheritance. The word tasted like ash. It meant a return, a forced confrontation with the ghosts I'd so meticulously entombed. My breath hitched. I could almost smell the damp earth and decaying velvet that permeated the old house. I tried to push it down, to compartmentalize, as I always did. I'd built a life for myself, a successful one. My paintings sold. Critics lauded my ability to capture raw emotion, the unsettling undercurrents of the human psyche. They didn't know the half of it. The solicitor's letter mentioned an immediate transfer of ownership, urging my presence to settle affairs. It was dated 2 weeks ago. He was gone. Elena, the woman who'd always smelled faintly of lavender and something sharp, like old pennies. The woman who'd kept the attic locked. I walked to the easel, my reflection staring back from the polished wood. The anxiety was a constant companion, a low thrum beneath the surface of my carefully constructed composure. It spiked now, sharp and visceral. Blackwood Manor, the place where it all began, the place where she resided. Lila, the doll. I hadn't thought of her not truly in years. I remembered the way her porcelain eyes seemed to follow me, the unnerving stillness of her painted smile. "Just a doll, Dean," he'd say, his voice devoid of warmth, but I knew. The letter lay on my work table, a stark white rectangle against the vibrant chaos of my art. It was an invitation, or perhaps a summons, a forced homecoming. I could refuse, of course. Disown the inheritance, let the house crumble into dust. But a morbid curiosity, a need to understand what had festered in that place for so long, gnawed at me. I found myself packing a small bag, my movements jerky, almost involuntary. The city lights blurred outside my window as I hailed a cab. The driver, a burly man with calloused hands, asked for the destination with a gruff politeness. When I spoke the name, he flinched, a barely perceptible tremor that I, with my hyper-vigilance, caught immediately. "Blackwood Manor," I repeated, my voice rough. He cleared his throat. "Long way out, and it's got a reputation, that place." He didn't elaborate, and I didn't press. He knew. They all knew in hushed tones, averted gazes. The house was a blight. The road narrowed, trees clawing at the sky on either side, their branches skeletal fingers against the moonless expanse. Something stagnant, like long undisturbed water. Finally, a break in the trees. A wrought iron gate, rusted and askew, creaked open as the cab approached. Beyond it, a long, winding driveway choked with weeds, and at the end of it, silhouetted against the Inkai sky, stood Blackwood Manor. It was more imposing, more derelict than I remembered. My heart, a traitorous organ, began to thud a heavy, irregular rhythm against my ribs. The cab stopped at the foot of the crumbling steps. The driver, his face pale in the dim interior light, refused to go any further. "This is as close as I'm going, sir," he stammered, his hands gripping the steering wheel. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of decay, and something else I couldn't quite place a cloying sweetness, like overripe fruit left to rot. The manor loomed, a silent sentinel guarding its secrets. A single, flickering light emanated from a small structure nestled amongst the overgrown gardens, a peculiar glow in the pervasive gloom. It was the chapel. Elena had always been devout, her faith a rigid structure that had never quite accommodated my own fragile sensibilities. I remembered visiting it once as a child, the air thick with incense and the scent of melting wax. Now, it seemed to pulse with an unnatural luminescence. Why was it lit? No welcoming light, no sound, just an invitation into the moor. What waited for me inside? The heavy iron gate groaned a protest as I pushed it open. It hadn't been oiled in decades, if ever. Rust flaked off in my hand, staining my palm a dull ochre. The path leading to the house was choked with weeds, their thorny tendrils snagging at my trousers. Each step felt like an intrusion, a violation of something ancient and undisturbed. The manor itself seemed to inhale, a vast, shadowed lung contracting around me. Its windows were dark like vacant eyes, reflecting only the bruised twilight sky. I don't know what I'd expected. A grand, if dilapidated, estate. Something that spoke of a life, however solitary. But this place felt more like a tomb. The air, already thick with the scent of decay, now carried a faint metallic tang like old pennies. It settled on my tongue, a coppery film. My breath hitched. I told myself it was just the damp, the stagnant air of a house left to rot. The small scent, light I'd seen from the gate, was indeed a single candle, guttering on a small, dusty table just inside the front door. The wallpaper, once a vibrant floral pattern, now peeled in strips like sunburnt skin, revealing damp, discolored plaster beneath. A grandfather clock stood silent in the corner, its pendulum frozen mid-swing, a monument to arrested time. My grandmother, I barely remembered her. A stern, distant figure, always smelling of lavender and something sharp, like mothballs. She'd never approved of my mother, and by extension me. Her will had been a surprise, a final, cryptic gesture from a woman I'd always believed had forgotten my existence. And now this house, this mausoleum. My footsteps echoed on the bare wooden floorboards, each creak and groan amplified in the stillness. It seeped into my bones, raising goosebumps on my arms. To my left, a grand staircase swept upwards into blackness. Its banister was carved with intricate, unsettling figures' faces contorted in silent screams, intertwined serpents. I avoided touching it. I decided to explore the ground floor first. A set of heavy double doors beckoned. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the ornate brass knob. Taking a deep, shaky breath, I turned it. The mechanism was stiff, protesting with a low grind that scraped against my nerves. The room beyond was a vast, cavernous space. My eyes struggled to adjust. It took a moment for the shapes to resolve themselves from the gloom. It was a ballroom, or had been once. Dust sheets draped over furniture like spectral shrouds. The air here was even more stagnant, carrying a faint, musty odor like old paper and dried flowers. But beneath that, something else. A faint, sweet perfume, sickly and cloying. The same scent I'd noticed outside, but stronger now. It made my head swim. My gaze swept across the room, drawn to a large, ornate mirror leaning against the far wall. Its frame was gilded, tarnished with age, but the glass itself was surprisingly clear, reflecting the dim light and the ghostly shapes of the shrouded furniture. As I approached, I saw something move in the periphery of my vision. A flicker. I stopped, my heart thudding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I stared into the mirror, my own reflection a pale, drawn figure in the gloom. Nothing, just the dust motes dancing in the faint light. I chided myself. Nerves, that was all. This place was designed to unnerve. Then my eyes caught something on the floor near the base of the mirror. A small porcelain object. It was half hidden by a fallen sheet. I knelt, my knees cracking in protest, and carefully pulled the sheet back. It was a doll, not just any doll. My breath caught in my throat, a strangled gasp. It was Lila, smaller than I remembered, but unmistakably her. Her painted eyes, wide and unnervingly blue, seemed to stare directly at me. A faint, knowing smile etched onto her porcelain lips. A wave of nausea washed over me. The sickly sweet perfume intensified, wrapping around me like a suffocating embrace. I could feel a prickling sensation on my skin, as if tiny insects were crawling beneath the surface. I wanted to recoil, to snatch my hand back, But I was frozen, my gaze locked on the doll's vacant, painted stare. A faint sound drifted from somewhere deeper within the house. A soft, rhythmic creaking, like a child's swing, moving gently back and forth. What was that sound? And why did it feel like it was coming from the room where Lila always used to be kept? The air inside the mansion tasted like dust and forgotten lives. My footsteps echoed on the bare floorboards, each creak a nervous tremor in the oppressive silence. Sunlight, fractured by grimy panes, cast long, skeletal shadows across the cavernous rooms. My grandmother's belongings were stacked and shrouded, ghostly forms under white sheets. I moved through the house like a trespasser, a phantom in a place that was supposed to be mine. My grandmother had been a collector, an accumulator of things. Boxes overflowed with brittle photographs, yellowed letters tied with faded ribbon, and trinkets I couldn't identify. The smell of dried lavender and something else, something metallic and faintly sour, clung to everything. I opened a large mahogany chest in what must have been her study. Inside, nestled amongst moth-eaten lace and brittle velvet, was a child's rocking chair, impassably small. It was empty. My breath hitched. I'd been avoiding the attic. The attic was where she kept the truly special things, the things she'd said were too precious for the rest of the house. But the pull was undeniable, a morbid curiosity that gnawed at my resolve. The pull, I suspected, was Lila. The attic stairs groaned under my weight, each step a protest against my intrusion. Cobwebs, thick as carton batting, brushed against my face, clinging to my hair and eyelashes. The single bare bulb overhead cast a weak, flickering light, illuminating a landscape of forgotten treasures and decaying memories. I moved deeper into the gloom, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. It felt watched. I ran a hand over a large, velvet-covered trunk. It was cool to the touch, almost unnaturally so. My fingers traced the intricate, tarnished brass fittings. This was it. I could feel it. With a grunt, I heaved the lid open. The hinges shrieked in protest, a sound that scraped against my nerves. The contents were a jumbled mess of textiles, brittle paper, and the faint, cloying scent of aged perfume. I dug through layers of faded silk and lace, my hands growing clammy. Then my fingers brushed against something hard, something smooth. It was locked. My frustration flared, a hot, unwelcome emotion. I searched the immediate vicinity, my gaze darting around the dusty corners. Tucked beneath a pile of embroidered linens, I found a small, ornate key. It fit. The lid of the box lifted with a soft click. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded blue satin, was Lila. It was exactly as I remembered her, yet impossibly worse. Her porcelain face, once a pale, innocent canvas, was now cracked. The painted blush on her cheeks chipped away to reveal a dull, grayish undertone. Her glass eyes, a startling, unnerving shade of blue, seemed to follow me, fixed in a perpetual knowing stare. Her yarn hair, once a vibrant red, was matted and dull, a tangled mess that framed her unnervingly still expression. She wore the same faded calico dress, the fabric now brittle and stained. My hands trembled, refusing to still. The air in the attic suddenly felt thick, suffocating. I could feel a prickling sensation on my skin, as if tiny insects were crawling beneath my clothes. The memory, a fragmented shard of terror, flashed behind my eyes, a small hand reaching out, a whisper in the dark, the cold, hard feel of porcelain against my cheek. I slammed the box shut, the sound deafening in the stillness. The lock clicked home, a definitive, final sound. But the image of Lila's eyes, those unblinking, malevolent blue spheres, was burned into my mind. They held a terrible, ancient knowing. They promised more than just memories. They promised a return. I backed away from the trunk, my gaze fixed on it as if it might spring to life. My breath came in ragged gasps. I could hear it then, a faint sound, barely perceptible. It was coming from downstairs, from the direction of the chapel during lockdown, altar candles only light. Was it just the old house settling? My grandmother's belongings were stacked and shrouded, like forgotten mourners at a wake. I'd spent the first few days sorting through the detritus of a life I barely knew, the scent of mothballs and decay clinging to everything like a shroud. It was a suffocating inheritance. Then I found the chapel during lockdown, altar candles only light. It wasn't on any of the floor plans, I'd unearthed from a dusty desk drawer, tucked away at the far end of the west wing, behind a warped oak door that groaned in protest when I finally managed to pry it open. The room was a stark contrast to the rest of the house. It was small, intimate, and remarkably preserved. The air here was different, cooler, with a faint, almost sweet perfume that I couldn't quite place, like dried lavender and something else, something metallic. The only illumination came from 3 thick, tallow altar candles, their flames flickering with an unnatural steadiness, casting an amber glow that danced and writhed across the worn stone walls. The small altar itself was bare, save for a tarnished silver crucifix and a single chipped ceramic bowl. It felt wrong, this sacred space in such a ruin, but more than wrong, it felt watched. I ran a hand along the smooth, cool wood of the pew in front of the altar. It was polished, unlike the dusty surfaces elsewhere. Someone had been here, recently, but who? The estate lawyer had been clear. No one had entered the house for years, not since my grandmother's passing. He'd even hired a security firm to keep trespassers out, but there was no wind. The air in the chapel was still heavy. I spun around, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. Nothing. I tried to convince myself it was the house settling, the old timbers groaning under their own weight. It had sounded like a name. My name. I moved closer to the altar, drawn by an invisible current. My gaze fell upon the ceramic bowl. I recoiled, a shiver snaking down my spine. I told myself it was old wine or perhaps paint. My grandmother had been an amateur artist, I remembered, but the stain looked too uniform, too visceral. Then the candle flames. They seemed to lean, to sway in unison, as if responding to a breath I couldn't feel. The sweet, metallic scent intensified, thick and cloying. I felt a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, the undeniable feeling of eyes upon me. But there was no one. Just me, the decaying grandeur, and the unsettling stillness of the chapel. I backed away slowly, my eyes never leaving the altar. Each step was a conscious effort, a battle against an urge to flee, an urge to understand. As my fingers closed around it, a sound echoed from the depths of the chapel, a soft, rhythmic tapping. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the direction of the altar. I froze. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate like small fingernails on wood. It was a sound that burrowed under my skin, a sound I hadn't heard in years, a sound I desperately tried to forget. It was the sound of Lila. My breath hitched. This was impossible. Lila was a doll, a grotesque porcelain thing that had haunted my childhood nightmares. He was supposed to be gone, locked away, destroyed. But the tapping, it was undeniable. I forced myself to look back. It was indistinct, shifting, but it had a shape. A small, hunched shape. The tapping stopped. Silence descended again, thicker, more suffocating than before. The sweet, metallic scent was overpowering now, making my head swim. I could feel sweat beading on my forehead, my palms slick against the doorframe. A trick of the light, a draft from an unseen opening, anything but what my gut was screaming. Then a faint, rustling sound, like old silk being dragged across stone. My eyes darted to the altar again. The ceramic bowl was no longer empty. It looked like a button, a small pearl button, identical to the ones on Lila's faded blue dress. My legs felt like lead. I wanted to run, to scream, to shatter the suffocating peace of this hidden sanctuary. But I was rooted to the spot, a morbid fascination holding me captive. And from it, I heard it again, a faint, childish giggle, a sound that was both innocent and utterly, profoundly wrong. What was happening in this forgotten chapel? And how had Lila's influence seeped into this place, into the very air I breathed? The air inside the chapel during lockdown, altar candles' only light was thick, cloying, and impassably still. Not a single draft dared to stir the heavy scent of burnt wax and something else. Something metallic and sweet, like old pennies left too long in a damp hand. I'd found my way here by instinct, or perhaps by a pull I couldn't articulate, a desperate need for a space that felt less alive than the rest of this rotting monument to my family's decay. My grandmother's belongings were stacked in the main hall, a chaotic monument to a life I barely knew. But here, in this small, forgotten chapel tucked away in the west wing, the stillness was a different kind. It was a pre-death stillness, a hushed reverence for something already gone. The only illumination came from the altar candles, Their flames a sickly, wavering yellow, casting dancing shadows that made the carved wooden saints on the walls seem to writhe. I ran a hand over the cold, polished wood of the pew in front of me. It was smooth, worn by countless knees, but now it felt clammy. My fingers came away with a faint, greasy residue. I wiped them on my jeans, a shiver tracing a path down my spine. My art studio, usually a sanctuary, had become a battleground. The blank canvases, once invitations, now felt like accusations. The smell of turpentine and linseed oil, once invigorating, now seemed to cling to me like a shroud. I'd been trying to paint, to lose myself in the familiar rhythm of brushstrokes, but my hands wouldn't obey. They moved with a will of their own, guided by a force that felt alien and ancient. I'd started with abstract forms, swirling colors meant to capture the unsettling atmosphere of the mansion. The forms twisted, coalescing into shapes that made my stomach clench. A child's hand, impassably small and contorted, reaching. A vacant, staring eye, too large for any face. These weren't conscious choices. They were eruptions from a place I'd buried so deep, I'd convinced myself it no longer existed. The doll, Lila. Her name was a whisper in the back of my mind, a phantom itch I couldn't scratch. I hadn't seen her since that day, not truly. But her presence here was undeniable, a palpable pressure in the air. I tried to paint over the disturbing images, to obliterate them, but they always bled through, a spectral stain on the fresh canvas. My latest piece was the worst. It was a portrait, or what passed for one. The face was indistinct, blurred by thick impasto, but the eyes. They were Lila's eyes, or what I remembered of them. Wide, unblinking, filled with an ancient, knowing malice, a ligature mark. I'd painted it without thinking, without conscious intent, and the memory of it sent a fresh wave of nausea through me. The chapel felt cooler now, the air growing heavier. The candle flames flickered violently, as if a sudden gust had swept through the sealed room. I looked at my hands. They were stained with paint, streaks of ochre and crimson marring my skin. But beneath the pigment, I could see them trembling. My knuckles were white. She'd never spoken of Lila, not directly. Had she known? Had she understood the power this thing held? A low hum began to vibrate through the floorboards, a sound that seemed to emanate from the very foundations of the house. It was a deep, resonant thrum, like a giant heart beating in the earth. The altar candles sputtered, their flames shrinking to mere pinpricks of light. I stood up, my legs feeling like lead. The hum intensified, a physical force pressing against my eardrums. My paintings, back in the studio, were no longer just reflections of my trauma. They were invitations. They were portals. The candle flames steadied, their light seeming to grow stronger, casting an eerie, almost phosphorescent glow. In the flickering light, the carved wooden figures on the walls seemed to shift, their painted eyes following my movements. My own reflection, caught in the polished surface of the altar, was gaunt, my eyes wide with a fear I hadn't felt since childhood, a flicker of defiance. But I was an artist. I understood creation. And perhaps, just perhaps, I could use that understanding to fight back. But how do I fight something that exists only in the twisted landscapes of my own mind, amplified by an ancient, malevolent presence? What happens when the canvas becomes a mirror and the reflection starts to look back with eyes that are not my own? The chapel during lockdown, altar candles only light, offered no sanctuary. It offered only the suffocating stillness I'd felt before, the cloying scent of burnt wax now laced with a deeper, fouler odor that I recognized with a sickening lurch. It was the smell of decay, of something long dead trying to breathe again. My breath hitched, a ragged sound in the oppressive quiet. My palms, slick with a cold sweat I couldn't wipe away, brushed against the rough, splintered wood of the pew. A memory, perhaps, or something worse. The stained glass windows, depicting scenes I'd once found comforting, now seemed to leer, their muted colors bleeding into one another like bruised flesh. My gaze fell upon a small, tarnished silver locket lying near the altar steps. I picked it up, my fingers trembling. It sprang open with a faint click. Inside, faded sepia photographs stared back at me. One was of my grandmother, younger, her face etched with a sorrow I'd never seen. The other was of a child, a girl, with vacant eyes and a doll clutched in her arms. It was her, Lila, but the girl in the photograph wasn't me. Who was this child? And why did she look so much like me? I'd always assumed Lila was just a doll, a vessel for some unseen malice. But this photograph suggested a far more disturbing truth. Lila wasn't just a doll, he was a keeper of secrets and perhaps of souls. My eyes scanned the altar, searching. My grandmother had been a woman of devout faith, or so I'd been told. Yet here in this secluded place, I felt the undeniable presence of something ancient and unholy. Tucked beneath a loose floorboard near the altar, my fingers found a small, leather-bound journal. Its pages were brittle, the ink faded but legible. It was my grandmother's. She wrote of Lila not as an object, but as a burden. A pact, she called it, a desperate bargain struck in the throes of her own childhood despair. He had been a lonely child, ostracized, and in her isolation he had found Lila. Not in a toy shop, but in the dusty attic of this very mansion, nestled amongst forgotten heirlooms. The child in the photograph, her name was Elena, her own younger sister. Elena had been sickly, frail, and desperately unhappy. My grandmother, consumed by a possessive love and a fear of losing her, had sought a way to preserve Elena, to keep her spirit tethered to this world, to her. The words swam before my eyes. My grandmother had believed Lila could hold Elena's essence, but the ritual, as described, was not one of preservation. It was one of consumption. Lila, in her porcelain shell, had become a conduit, draining Elena's life force, trapping her consciousness within the doll. The metallic, sweet scent in the air. It was the lingering trace of that stolen life. My grandmother, in her grief and guilt, had eventually passed the burden on, not to another sibling, but to me. When I was a child, small and vulnerable, he had brought Lila into my life. He had presented her as a gift, a comfort. The journal spoke of my own childhood nightmares, of my increasing withdrawn nature, of the fear that had plagued me. It wasn't just the doll. My hands shook violently as I turned the pages. There was a specific entry, dated years ago, the ink almost illegible, scrawled in a haste that screamed desperation. It spoke of a final, terrible choice. My grandmother, weakened by years of harboring Elena's trapped spirit, was fading. He had decided to sever the connection, to release Elena, but the journal hinted at the cost, a sacrifice. My grandmother hadn't just passed on a burden, he had passed on a debt. And the entity within Lila, Elena's fractured spirit, was not content to remain a silent witness. It wanted more. It wanted release. It wanted me. I looked down at the locket, at the vacant stare of the child in the photograph. Her eyes, even in the faded image, seemed to hold a desperate plea. There was that Elena, or was it Lila, wearing Elena's face, waiting? The journal ended abruptly, a single smudged word scrawled across the final page. Mine. Whose? Elena's, Lila's, or my grandmother's. And if my grandmother had tried to end it, what had she truly done? My throat tightened. I pushed against the heavy oak door, but it wouldn't budge. Locked, of course. Lila wouldn't let me leave that easily. A faint scraping sound echoed from the nave. My eyes darted towards the shadows pooling beneath the pews. Nothing. Just the settling groans of an old house, I told myself, my breath catching in my chest. The air grew heavy, thick with an unseen presence. The flickering candlelight, the only illumination in the vast space, cast dancing, distorted figures on the stained glass windows. Saints and martyrs contorted into grotesque shapes, their painted eyes seeming to follow me. I backed away from the door, my boots crunching on something brittle on the stone floor. I looked down. A scattering of dried, brittle leaves. Not unusual, I supposed, given the state of the grounds. But these felt wrong, too dry, too brittle, like ancient parchment. A sudden gust of wind, impassable in this sealed space, snaked through the chapel, extinguishing 2 of the altar candles. Darkness bloomed, swallowing the edges of my vision. The temperature plummeted. Gooseflesh erupted on my arms, my skin prickling with a primal fear. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Lila, he was here. I could almost taste her amusement, a sour metallic tang on my tongue. The scraping sound came again, closer this time, from the direction of the choir loft. It was slow, deliberate, like something heavy being dragged across wood. It's just the house. The smell of decay intensified, now mingled with the faint, sickly sweetness of wilting flowers. I remembered the wilted roses on the altar, a detail I'd dismissed earlier. I reached for my phone, fumbling in my pocket. No signal, not even a flicker of a bar. I'd noticed it earlier, the dead zones, but now it felt deliberate. A cage. I was in a cage. The scraping stopped. Silence descended, a heavy blanket pressing in on me. Then a soft, childish giggle, impassably close, echoed from the back of the chapel. My head snapped up. My eyes strained against the gloom. A figure began to form, indistinct at first, then resolving into the shape of a small girl. He was dressed in a tattered, old-fashioned frock, her hair a tangled mess, and he was holding something. A doll. She didn't move. She just stood there, bathed in the faint, dying light of the remaining candles, her head tilted slightly. Her eyes, I felt them, even though I couldn't see them clearly. They were fixed on me. A profound stillness settled over me, a terrifying calm that preceded a storm. The house was alive with her. I took a step back, my heel catching on the edge of a pew. I stumbled, my hands flying out to steady myself. The rough wood scraped my palms. The pain was a welcome distraction, a grounding sensation in the swirling unreality. When I looked up, the figure was gone. The giggle had faded, but the feeling of being watched, of being hunted, remained. Tap, tap, tap. It was slow, insistent, like a child's impatient finger against glass, or perhaps against bone. I forced myself to move to break the paralysis of fear. I had to get out. I had to find a way. I twisted. I threw my shoulder against it, the solid oak groaning in protest, but it held firm. It was as if the entire structure had shifted, reinforcing itself. They thickening. The scent of decay was overwhelming now, a putrid perfume that clung to the back of my tongue. I could feel a pressure building behind my eyes, a dull ache that mirrored the insistent tapping in the walls. The tapping grew louder, faster. It was no longer just in the walls. It seemed to emanate from everywhere, a cacophony of tiny, sharp sounds. It was the sound of 1,000 tiny fingers, scratching, clawing, trying to get in. Or perhaps, trying to get out. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing my palms against my temples. This was a trick, a cruel, elaborate illusion. I had to break it. I had to find the thread, the single point of reality in this tangled web of fear. It was a voice, high and reedy, speaking my name. And why did it sound so much like Lila? The whispers clawed at the edges of my hearing, a dry rustle like dead leaves skittering across a forgotten floor. Lila. It was her voice, or a mockery of it, thin and reedy, laced with a malice that curdled my stomach. I stumbled through the cavernous, dust-choked halls of the mansion, my footsteps echoing with a hollow finality. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of decay and something else, something cloyingly sweet, like overripe fruit left to rot. My hands trembled, slick with a nervous sweat that felt like the house itself was weeping. I found myself drawn, as if by an invisible string, towards the west wing. This was where he had always been kept, tucked away in the attic, a forgotten relic of my grandmother's peculiar affections. But the attic was sealed, boarded up years ago. How was she here? How was she? Speaking. The hallway narrowed, the peeling wallpaper pressing in, its once vibrant floral patterns now a mottled tapestry of grime and mildew. My breath plumed in the frigid air, like something being dragged. I rounded a corner, and there it was. The door to the chapel. It stood ajar, revealing a sliver of the interior. Light. My grandmother, a woman of stern, unbending faith, had always kept this place meticulously maintained, even as the rest of the mansion succumbed to neglect. It was her sanctuary, and now it felt like a trap. Hesitantly, I pushed the door open. The hinges groaned in protest, a long, mournful cry that echoed through the stillness. The interior was bathed in a flickering amber glow. Altar candles, the scent of beeswax and something metallic, like old blood, hung heavy in the air. And there, on the worn velvet cushion of the altar, sat Lila. Her porcelain face, usually a sickly pale, seemed to gleam with an inner luminescence. Her glass eyes, fixed and vacant, stared out at nothing, yet I felt their gaze pierce through me, dissecting my deepest fears. Her painted smile, a rictus of childish innocence, was a grotesque mockery in this place. The scraping sound. It was her. Her tiny, stitched hands, impassibly articulated, were dragging the edge of her lace-trimmed dress across the velvet. It wasn't coming from her mouth, but from everywhere at once, a phantom echo in the stillness. I raised the poker, my grip tight. My voice, when I finally managed to speak, was a ragged rasp. "What do you want?" Her head tilted, a jerky, unnatural movement. "I am, Dean, more real than I know. I am the memory I buried. They seem to writhe with a life of their own, coiling and uncoiling like serpents. I let me in, and now I belong to me." My grip tightened on the poker. My vision swam. But beneath the fear, a flicker of something else ignited. Anger, a desperate primal rage. I wouldn't let her win, not again. I lunged forward, the poker held high. The doll remained still, her painted eyes unwavering. Was this a trap? Was she waiting for me to make a move? The air crackled with an unseen energy. I could feel a pressure building, an unbearable weight that threatened to crush me. As I brought the poker down, did the doll smile? My knuckles were white, the cheap metal of the poker digging into my palm. The air in the chapel during lockdown, altar candles' only light, was thick, cloying. It tasted of old dust and something else, something metallic and sharp, like a freshly broken bone. Lila's whispers, usually a sibilant hiss at the edge of my hearing, were a roaring torrent now, a hurricane of doubt and malice directly in my mind. They spoke of the endless nights I'd spent sketching her, her porcelain grin a constant fixture in my nightmares. They reminded me of the way the light used to catch her glass eyes, making them seem alive, watching. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to banish the images. My own reflection, gaunt and wild-eyed, stared back from the polished brass of the altar. I looked like a stranger, a man hollowed out by a war I hadn't known I was fighting until it was already raging inside me. I will never escape. I am mine. I always have been. They were so convincing, so laced with a truth that felt like poison. I could feel the edges of my resolve fraying, each word a tiny, sharp shard tearing at my sanity. My breath hitched. My lungs burned. This was it then. This was the end of the line. The artist, broken by his muse. But then, a different sound. A faint, rhythmic scraping. It was small, almost lost in the cacophony of Lila's mental assault, but it was distinct. I strained my ears, my body rigid, every nerve ending screaming with a primal urge to flee. The scraping continued, a hesitant, insistent rhythm. Scrape, pause, scrape. My gaze snapped to the confessional. The heavy oak door, usually shut tight, was ajar. I took a tentative step forward, the poker held out like a shield. They recoiled, a physical sensation like cold water washing over my skin. "What is that?" Lila's voice, no longer a roar, was a frantic, reedy question. "Go away, leave it." The scraping stopped. Silence descended, heavy and expectant. I held my breath, waiting. Slowly, deliberately, I advanced. Each creak of the floorboards under my worn boots sounded like a gunshot. A faint scent, something sickly sweet and cloying like decaying flowers, wafted from the opening. It made my stomach clench. I reached the booth. The gap in the door was wider now, as if something had nudged it open further. My hand trembled as I reached for the heavy brass handle. I pulled. The door swung inward with a long, drawn-out groan. The sickly sweet smell intensified, making my eyes water. I couldn't see anything, not at first. Then, as my eyes adjusted, I saw it. On the worn wooden seat, a small child's hand. It was pale, almost translucent. It was covered in a fine layer of dust. It was not entirely detached, but it was wrong, twisted at an unnatural angle as if it had been forced into that position. The scraping, it hadn't been Lila, it had been this. A choked gasp escaped my lips. My mind reeled, trying to reconcile the image with reality. It was impossible, utterly, horrifyingly impossible. "It's just a doll's hand," I told myself, the words a desperate plea. A trick of the light, a hallucination. But the smell, the dampness on the handle. Did I think it was me? Did I really think I was the only one? Oh, Dean, I was always so easily fooled. My vision blurred again, but this time it wasn't fear. It was a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. The poker slipped from my grasp, clattering onto the stone floor with a deafening clang. I stumbled back, my hand flying to my mouth to stifle a sob. The hand in the confessional remained, a small, damning testament to the hidden horrors of this house. It was a fragment, a piece of something far older and more terrible than Lila, and it was still there, waiting. The chapel doors slammed shut behind me, the sound echoing through the empty halls. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The candles in the chapel continued to burn, their flames casting an unsteady glow on the empty altar. But the true light, the light of understanding, had been extinguished.